The fever had turned Natalie's cheeks crimson and made her hands shake as she carried the heavy iron pot across the dining room of the Mountain Rose Inn. But she refused to stop working because Mrs. Henderson had made it clear that missing even one shift would mean losing her job entirely. The autumn of 1876 had been cruel to the mining town of Rico, Colorado, nestled high in the San Juan Mountains, and jobs for young women without family connections were scarce as gold in a played-out claim. Natalie Ashford had been working at the inn for nearly 8 months now, ever since she had arrived on the stagecoach from Denver with nothing but a worn carpet bag and determination to make her own way in the world at 22 years old. The dining room spun slightly as she set the pot down on the long wooden table where the miners and travelers took their meals. She gripped the edge of the table, willing herself to stay upright, to finish this one task, and then the next and the next until her shift ended at sunset. The grandfather clock in the corner showed 2:30 in the afternoon. 3.5 more hours. She could manage that, surely. "Miss Ashford, you look positively green," said Mr. Whitley, one of the regular boarders who worked at the assay office. He was a kind man in his 50s with spectacles that constantly slipped down his nose. "Perhaps you should sit down for a moment." "I am perfectly well, thank you," Natalie lied, forcing herself to straighten up despite the way the room continued its lazy rotation. Her dark blonde hair, normally pinned up neatly, had started to come loose in damp tendrils around her face. She could feel the sweat on her forehead despite the cool mountain air that leaked through the inn's windows. The bell above the door chimed as someone entered, bringing with them a gust of wind that smelled of pine and approaching winter. Natalie turned toward the sound, then had to grab the table again as dizziness overwhelmed her. Through blurred vision, she saw the largest man she had ever encountered duck through the doorway. He had to be well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly brushed the doorframe. His dark hair fell past his collar in waves that suggested he cut it himself when it got too long to be practical. He wore buckskin clothes that marked him as someone who spent most of his time in the wilderness rather than in town, and his tanned face bore the weathered look of a man who lived by his own rules. Tobias Brennan had come down from his cabin high in the mountains because he needed supplies before the first serious snow closed the passes for the winter. He preferred his solitude up there among the peaks and forests, where the only sounds were wind through the pines and the occasional call of an eagle. He trapped furs in the winter, panned for gold in the summer, and hunted year-round, trading his pelts and occasional gold dust for the few things he could not make or grow himself. He came to Rico only 3 or 4 times a year, and each time he found the town more crowded and more civilized, which made him eager to return to his mountain sanctuary. But as his eyes adjusted to the dimmer light inside the inn, he forgot about his distaste for civilization entirely. The young woman standing near the table looked like she was about to collapse. Her face was flushed with fever, her eyes glassy and unfocused, and she swayed on her feet like a pine tree in a high wind. Even from across the room, Tobias could see the tremor in her hands as she tried to pick up a stack of plates. He crossed the room in 4 long strides, his boots heavy on the wooden floorboards. Natalie looked up at him, startled by his sudden appearance beside her. She had an impression of intense dark eyes studying her face with an expression of concern before those eyes shifted to something harder. "You need to sit down," Tobias said. His voice was deep and rough from disuse, since he rarely spoke to anyone for weeks at a time up in his cabin. "I need to finish my work," Natalie replied, though her voice came out thinner than she intended. She tried to step around him, but he moved to block her path. The sheer size of him made arguing seem futile, but she tried anyway. "Please move. I have duties to attend to." "Your duty right now is to yourself," Tobias said. He had seen plenty of sick animals in his years in the wilderness, and he knew that pushing through illness only made things worse. This young woman needed rest and care, not work. "Where is the person who runs this place, Mrs. Henderson is in the kitchen," Mr. Whitley offered helpfully, watching the exchange with interest. It was not every day that Tobias Brennan came to town, and it was certainly unusual to see him take an interest in anything other than getting his supplies and leaving as quickly as possible. Tobias turned toward the kitchen, but Natalie grabbed his arm. Even through the buckskin, she could feel the solid muscle beneath. "Please do not bother Mrs. Henderson. She will dismiss me if she thinks I cannot work." "Then she is a fool," Tobias said flatly. He looked down at the small hand on his arm, then back at her flushed face. Something in her green eyes, even clouded with fever as they were, made his chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. "You are burning up with fever. Working through it will only make you sicker." "I have nowhere else to go," Natalie said, and hated the way her voice broke on the words. "This job provides my room and board. If I lose it, I have nothing." Tobias felt a wave of anger at whoever had put this young woman in such a desperate position. He had chosen his isolated life in the mountains, but he had always known it was a choice. This woman clearly had no choices at all. "You have a room here, a small one on the 3rd floor, yes. Then that is where you are going right now." He did not wait for her to argue further. Instead, he simply bent down and scooped her up into his arms as though she weighed no more than a sack of flour. Natalie let out a small gasp of surprise, but she was too weak and dizzy to struggle effectively. "Put me down," she protested weakly as he carried her toward the stairs. "You cannot just carry me off like this." "I just did," Tobias replied. He was aware of several pairs of eyes watching them, but he did not care what the townspeople thought. He had never cared about that. "Which room?" Natalie knew she should fight harder, should demand he release her. But the truth was that being carried felt wonderful after hours of forcing herself to stay upright. His arms were solid and steady beneath her, and his chest was so broad that she felt almost protected, as though nothing bad could reach her while she was held by this mountain of a man. "3rd floor, last door on the right," she whispered. The stairs seemed endless, but Tobias climbed them without any sign of strain. Natalie closed her eyes and let her head rest against his shoulder, just for a moment. She could smell pine and leather and wood smoke on him, scents that spoke of wild places far from the confines of the inn. When had anyone last taken care of her? When had anyone last thought her welfare was more important than what she could do for them? Her room was tiny, barely large enough for a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a washstand. A single window looked out over the mountains that rose behind the town. Tobias had to turn sideways to get through the door with her in his arms. He laid her gently on the bed, which creaked under even her slight weight. "Stay here," he commanded, though his tone had gentled slightly. "I will be back." "You do not need to," Natalie started to say, but he was already gone, moving with surprising quiet for such a large man. She heard his boots on the stairs, descending rapidly, and then she was alone in her room with only the sound of wind rattling the window frame. She tried to sit up, thinking she should go back downstairs before Mrs. Henderson discovered her absence, but the room spun wildly, and she fell back against the thin pillow with a small moan. Perhaps she could rest for just a few minutes, just until the dizziness passed. Just until she felt a bit stronger. Downstairs, Tobias found Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen, a thin woman with a permanently disapproving expression and graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked up from the pot she was stirring when he entered, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "We do not allow guests in the kitchen," she said sharply. "I am not a guest. I am someone telling you that Miss Ashford is ill with fever and will not be working for the next several days at minimum." Tobias spoke with the flat certainty of someone stating simple facts. "She needs rest and care." Mrs. Henderson's thin lips pressed together until they nearly disappeared. Miss Ashford knows very well that her employment depends on her fulfilling her duties. If she is too delicate to work through a bit of discomfort, then perhaps she is not suited for this position. A bit of discomfort. Tobias felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. He had dealt with grizzly bears that seemed more reasonable than this woman. She is ill enough that she was swaying on her feet. Would you rather she collapse in your dining room and frighten away your customers? "I would rather she do the job I hired her to do," Mrs. Henderson retorted. "The girl came here from Denver with grand ideas about making her own way, but she has proven to be more trouble than she is worth. Always with her head in a book when she should be working, always acting as though she is better than her station." Tobias took a step forward, and Mrs. Henderson actually backed up slightly. He was not a man who used his size to intimidate, but he was also not above it when the situation called for it. "Miss Ashford will keep her position and her room. She will rest until she is well. You will not disturb her or make demands of her. Is that clear?" "And who are you to give me orders in my own establishment?" Mrs. Henderson demanded, though her voice had lost some of its sharp edge. "Someone who will make it worth your while to show some basic human decency." Tobias reached into the leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a small nugget of gold, roughly the size of a walnut. He set it on the kitchen table with a solid thunk. "That should more than cover her wages for the next month and any inconvenience her absence causes you, Mrs." Henderson stared at the nugget, and Tobias could see the calculation in her eyes. Gold was gold, and this was more than she would make from a month of Natalie's labor. Finally, she nodded curtly. "Very well, but I expect her back at work when she is recovered." "When she is fully recovered," Tobias emphasized, "not before." He did not wait for her response, turning instead to survey the kitchen. "I need clean water, fresh cloths, and whatever food you have that would be suitable for someone with a fever. Broth, if you have it. Bread, nothing heavy." "I am not a servant," Mrs. Henderson protested. Tobias fixed her with a steady look. "Neither is Miss Ashford, though you seem to have forgotten that. The water, cloths, and food. Now." Something in his tone made it clear that this was not a request, and Mrs. Henderson found herself moving to comply despite her irritation. She had been running the Mountain Rose Inn for 12 years, and she was not accustomed to being ordered about in her own kitchen. But there was something about this mountain man, some quiet authority in the set of his shoulders and the steadiness of his gaze, that made disobedience seem unwise. While she gathered the items, Tobias went to the general store down the street. The proprietor, old Samuel Chen, greeted him with genuine warmth. Samuel was one of the few townspeople Tobias actually liked, perhaps because Samuel had also come from elsewhere and made his own way in a place that was not always welcoming to outsiders. "Tobias Brennan, as I live and breathe," Samuel said, his accent still carrying traces of his childhood in Canton despite his 40 years in America. "I thought you would be snowed in by now." "Soon," Tobias agreed. "I need supplies, but also some things for someone who is ill. Fever." Samuel's expression shifted to concern. "You are sick. You look healthy as an ox to me." "Not me. A young woman at the inn. She needs medicine, healing herbs if you have them. Willow bark for the fever, honey. Whatever you think would help." Samuel's eyebrows rose with interest, but he was too tactful to ask the questions clearly forming in his mind. Instead, he moved around the shop, gathering items and setting them on the counter. Willow bark, yes. I have dried chamomile as well, good for fever and for helping someone rest. Honey, of course. Some ginger root, you can make tea with it, settles the stomach if the fever has caused any upset. He paused, studying Tobias thoughtfully. This young woman must be important to you. I just met her, Tobias said, which was true but somehow did not capture the whole truth. Something about seeing Natalie trying to work through her obvious illness had stirred something protective in him, some instinct that went beyond simple compassion for a stranger. But no one should have to suffer alone when help is available. You have a good heart, my friend, Samuel said as he wrapped the items carefully, though you try to hide it up there in your mountains. He added a few more things to the package, some dried apricots, easy to eat, good for strength, and this. He held up a small jar. Salve I make myself, with beeswax and herbs. Good for rubbing on the chest when someone has fever, helps them breathe easier. Tobias paid for everything, not even asking the cost, and added a generous extra amount. Samuel tried to refuse it, but Tobias closed the man's fingers around the coins. For your kindness, he said simply. Back at the inn, he found Mrs. Henderson had left a bucket of clean water, a stack of cloths, and a tray with a steaming bowl of chicken broth and some bread outside Natalie's door, clearly not wanting to climb the 3 flights of stairs herself. Tobias made 2 trips to get everything into the small room, moving quietly in case Natalie had fallen asleep. She had not. She lay on the bed with her eyes closed, but he could see she was awake by the tension in her body and the way her fingers gripped the thin blanket. Her face was even more flushed than before, and when he touched the back of his hand to her forehead, she was burning up, her eyes opened at his touch, unfocused and confused. You came back, she whispered. I said I would. Tobias set down the supplies and turned to her. We need to get your fever down. I am going to help you sit up so you can drink something. He expected her to protest, to cling to some notion of propriety, but instead she simply nodded. The fever had stripped away her resistance, leaving her too exhausted to argue. Tobias slid one arm behind her shoulders and lifted her gently, propping her up against the wall since the bed had no headboard. Up close, he could see that beneath the flush of fever, she had delicate features and intelligent green eyes that watched him with a mixture of wariness and desperate hope. What is your first name? He asked as he prepared the willow bark tea Samuel had recommended. I know you as Miss Ashford, but if I am to take care of you, perhaps we should dispense with formalities. Natalie, she said, her voice hoarse. Natalie Ashford. Tobias Brennan, he replied, though he suspected she had already learned his name from someone downstairs. In a town the size of Rico, everyone knew everyone else's business, and a mountain man who kept to himself was always a subject of speculation and gossip. He brought the cup of tea to her lips. Drink this slowly. It will help with the fever. Natalie sipped obediently, making a face at the bitter taste. Tobias held the cup steady as she drank, noting how her hands trembled too much to hold it herself. When she had finished half the cup, he set it aside and offered her some of the broth Mrs. Henderson had provided. Natalie managed a few spoonfuls before shaking her head. No more, she whispered. Please. All right. Tobias set the bowl aside. But you need to get out of those clothes. They are damp with sweat, and you will not get better wearing wet things. Color rose in Natalie's already flushed cheeks. I cannot undress with you here. I have seen plenty of bodies in my time, Tobias said matter-of-factly, though he understood her discomfort. Animals, mostly, but the principle is the same. You need dry clothes, and you are too weak to manage on your own. He could see her struggling with this, pride and practicality warring in her fevered mind. I will turn my back. You tell me if you need help. He did turn away, focusing his attention on the small window while he listened to the rustling sounds behind him. It took much longer than it should have, and he heard her breathing become more labored with the effort. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was very small. "I cannot manage the buttons." Tobias turned back to find her sitting on the edge of the bed, still in her dress, but with her fingers fumbling uselessly at the buttons that ran down the back. She was crying silently, tears of frustration and exhaustion tracking down her flushed cheeks. The sight of those tears did something to his chest, made it ache in a way he had not experienced in years. "It is all right," he said gently, kneeling beside the bed so he was not looming over her. "I will help you. There is no shame in needing help when you are ill." His fingers were calloused and rough from years of hard work, but he was surprisingly deft with the small buttons. He had to be, since he often had to sew his own clothes and repair his own equipment up in the mountains where there was no one else to do such things. He worked quickly and efficiently, keeping his eyes focused on the task rather than on the smooth skin that appeared as the dress loosened. When the buttons were undone, he stood and turned his back again. "Can you manage from here?" "Yes," Natalie said, though she did not sound certain. "I have a nightgown in the dresser. Top drawer." Tobias found the nightgown, a simple white cotton garment that had been mended several times. He held it out behind him without looking and felt her take it from his hand. More rustling, a soft thump that might have been her dress falling to the floor, and then silence for so long that he grew concerned. "Natalie, I am all right," she said, but her voice was weak. "Just dizzy." He counted to 30, giving her time, then turned around. She had managed to get the nightgown on, but she was slumped on the edge of the bed, swaying slightly. Tobias crossed to her and eased her back down onto the mattress, pulling the blanket up over her. She was shivering now despite the fever, her body confused by the mixed signals of heat and cold. "I am going to make you more comfortable," he told her. "Trust me." He took one of the cloths from the stack Mrs. Henderson had provided and dipped it in the cool water, wringing it out thoroughly. Then he folded it and placed it gently on her forehead. Natalie's eyes closed, and she sighed with relief at the coolness against her burning skin. "That feels wonderful," she murmured. Tobias found himself smiling, a rare expression that felt strange on his face after so much time alone. He refreshed the cloth several times as it warmed from her fever, and gradually he saw some of the tension leave her body as the willow bark tea began to take effect. Her breathing deepened and became more regular. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly, her eyes opening to study his face. "You do not know me. I am nothing to you." Tobias considered the question as he wrung out the cloth again. Why was he doing this? He had intended to be in Rico for only a few hours, long enough to get his supplies and perhaps a hot meal before heading back up the mountain. He had no ties to this town or anyone in it. But when he had seen Natalie swaying on her feet, trying so hard to keep working despite her obvious illness, something in him had responded with fierce protectiveness. "Everyone deserves to have someone take care of them when they are sick," he said finally, "and you clearly have no one else." "I take care of myself," Natalie said, but there was no conviction in the words. "I can see that," Tobias replied. "You take care of yourself by working through a fever until you collapse. Very wise." Despite her illness, Natalie felt a spark of irritation at his sardonic tone. "You know nothing about my situation. Then tell me." Tobias settled into the room's only chair, a rickety wooden thing that creaked under his weight. "We have time, and talking might keep you awake long enough to drink more of that tea." Natalie studied him in the fading afternoon light that came through the window. He was watching her with an expression of genuine interest, not the false concern people sometimes showed when they wanted gossip to share. His face was all hard planes and strong features, but his eyes were surprisingly kind. She found herself wanting to tell him, wanting to share the burden she had been carrying alone for so long. "I came to Rico 8 months ago from Denver," she began. "My father died 2 years before that, and my mother passed last year. There were debts. Everything we had went to pay them, and there was nothing left. I tried to find work in Denver, but respectable positions for unmarried women are scarce, and I refused to take the other kind." Tobias nodded, understanding what she meant without her having to spell it out. He knew what happened to young women without means or protection in cities like Denver. "I heard that the mining towns needed workers," Natalie continued. "I thought perhaps there would be more opportunities here, that I could save money and eventually open a small shop of my own. A bookstore, perhaps, or a lending library. I love books." She smiled wistfully. "But jobs here are just as scarce unless you are willing to work in the saloons, and I needed respectable employment if I was to have any hope of establishing myself." "So you took a position at the inn," Tobias said. "Mrs. Henderson was the only one willing to hire me, but she made it clear from the start that my position was precarious. She said I had too many airs for someone in my situation, that I needed to learn my place. If I missed even a single day of work, I would be dismissed without references." Natalie's hands twisted in the blanket. "I have been saving every penny I can, but it is not enough, not nearly enough. I am trapped here, working endless hours for barely enough to keep body and soul together, with no way out." The bitterness in her voice made Tobias angry on her behalf. He had chosen his isolation, but she had been forced into a different kind of trap. "You are not trapped," he said firmly. "There are always choices." "Easy for you to say," Natalie replied, and now there was real heat in her voice despite her fever. "You are a man. You can go where you please, do as you please. No one questions you. No one tells you that you are getting above yourself or that you should know your place." "You are right," Tobias acknowledged, surprising her. "I do have freedoms you do not, but that does not mean you have no choices at all. It just means your choices are harder." Before Natalie could respond, her eyes suddenly rolled back and she began to shake. Tobias was on his feet instantly, recognizing the seizure for what it was. He had seen animals go into convulsions from high fevers, and he knew the danger. He turned her on her side so she would not choke and held her steady, as the tremors racked her body, murmuring words of comfort even though he knew she could not hear him. The seizure lasted less than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. When it passed, Natalie went limp and her breathing became shallow and rapid. Tobias felt real fear then. He was competent at treating injuries and common ailments, but this was beyond his experience. He needed help. He ran down the stairs 3 at a time and burst into the kitchen where Mrs. Henderson was preparing dinner. "Where is the doctor in this town?" Mrs. Henderson looked up, startled by his sudden appearance and the urgency in his voice. "Dr. Morrison. His office is 2 streets over above the hardware store. Why?" But Tobias was already gone. He ran through the streets of Rico, ignoring the startled looks from townspeople who stepped hastily out of his way. He found the hardware store and took the outside stairs to the 2nd floor 2 at a time, pounding on the door marked with a painted sign that read, "Dr. J. Morrison, Physician." The man who opened the door was in his 40s, with graying hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. He took one look at Tobias's face and reached for his medical bag without a word. "Where is the patient?" Mountain rose in. "3rd floor. Young woman, fever, and she just had some kind of fit. Shaking all over." Tobias was already heading back down the stairs. Dr. Morrison followed as quickly as his shorter legs allowed. "How long has she been ill?" "I do not know. I found her working at the inn this afternoon, clearly sick with fever. That was a few hours ago. She has gotten worse." They made it back to the inn in record time. Dr. Morrison had to pause to catch his breath at the bottom of the stairs to the third floor, but Tobias was already climbing. He found Natalie exactly as he had left her, still unconscious, her breathing worryingly shallow. Dr. Morrison conducted a thorough examination while Tobias watched anxiously from the corner of the small room. The doctor checked her pulse, listened to her breathing, looked at her eyes and throat. Finally, he straightened up with a sigh. Influenza, most likely, complicated by exhaustion and malnutrition. Has she been eating properly? Tobias thought about the thin frame he had felt when he carried her, the way her wrist bones had been too prominent when he helped her with her buttons. I doubt it. She has been working long hours and probably spending as little as possible on herself. Foolish girl, Dr. Morrison muttered, though his tone was not unkind. She has run herself into the ground. The seizure was caused by the high fever. We need to get that down, or she could have another one, possibly worse. Tell me what to do, Tobias said. Dr. Morrison looked at him with interest. You are planning to stay and care for her? Yes. Are you family? No. The doctor waited for more explanation, but when none came, he simply nodded. Very well. She will need constant attention for the next few days. The fever needs to be monitored and kept as low as possible. Cool cloths, especially on the forehead, neck, and wrists where the blood runs close to the surface. Get liquids into her whenever she is conscious enough to drink. Willow bark tea for the fever, broth for strength. If she can eat, give her bland foods, nothing heavy. I have been doing that, Tobias said. Good, continue. Watch for another seizure. If she has one that lasts longer than a minute or two, come get me immediately. Otherwise, keep doing what you are doing. Dr. Morrison began packing his bag. I will check on her tomorrow. In the meantime, you need to keep her as comfortable as possible and make sure she rests. No working, no getting out of bed except when absolutely necessary. I already paid Mrs. Henderson to ensure she would not be expected to work. Dr. Morrison's eyebrows rose. Did you now? That is very generous for someone who is not family. Tobias did not respond to the implicit question. How much do I owe you for the visit? They settled on a price, and Dr. Morrison left with a promise to return the next day. Tobias pulled the chair closer to Natalie's bedside and settled in for what he knew would be a long night. He refreshed the cloth on her forehead and managed to get a few more sips of willow bark tea into her when she stirred briefly toward consciousness. The hours passed slowly. Tobias was used to solitude and silence, but this was different from his quiet mountain evenings. There, the silence was peaceful, punctuated by the sounds of the forest and the crackling of his fire. Here, the silence was tense, broken only by Natalie's labored breathing and the occasional sounds from the floors below as other residents of the inn went about their evening routines. He found his eyes drawn to her face again and again. Even flushed with fever and drawn with illness, she was lovely in a way that made something in his chest tighten. But it was more than physical beauty that drew him. It was her determination to keep working despite her illness, her refusal to give up even when circumstances had conspired against her, the intelligence he had seen in her eyes when she looked at him. She reminded him of the wild creatures he encountered in the mountains, the ones who survived against all odds through sheer, stubborn will to live. Around midnight, Natalie's fever spiked again, and she became restless, tossing on the narrow bed and murmuring words he could not quite make out. Tobias increased the frequency of the cool cloths and tried to get more tea into her, but she was too agitated to drink properly. He remembered Samuel's salve and retrieved it from the supplies he had purchased. The instructions written on the jar said to rub it on the chest to help with breathing and fever. Tobias hesitated, knowing this meant touching her in a way that went beyond the simple care he had provided so far. But she was clearly struggling to breathe, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow movements that suggested her lungs were laboring. "Forgive me," he murmured, though she could not hear him. He pulled the blanket down and carefully undid the top buttons of her nightgown, just enough to expose her upper chest. The salve smelled of camphor and eucalyptus, sharp scents that cleared his own head as he warmed it between his palms. Then, as gently as he could, he rubbed it onto her chest in slow, circular motions. Natalie's breathing did seem to ease slightly, the rapid gasps becoming slower and deeper. Tobias rebuttoned her nightgown and pulled the blanket back up, then returned to his vigil. His eyes felt gritty with exhaustion, but he refused to sleep. What if she had another seizure and he was not awake to help her? What if her fever spiked even higher and he did not notice in time? Dawn light was just beginning to show through the window when Natalie's eyes finally opened fully. She looked around in confusion before her gaze settled on Tobias, still sitting in the chair beside her bed. "You stayed," she whispered. "Of course I stayed." Tobias leaned forward, touching her forehead. Her skin was still too warm, but the fever had definitely come down from its peak. "How do you feel?" "Terrible," Natalie admitted. "But better than before, I think. Everything is less fuzzy." She tried to sit up, but Tobias gently pressed her back down. "No getting up unless you absolutely must. Doctor's orders." "You brought a doctor?" Natalie's eyes widened. "I cannot afford a doctor." "I can," Tobias said simply. "And I did. You had a seizure from the fever. You scared me half to death." Natalie stared at him, trying to process this. A stranger had paid for her room, brought her a doctor, stayed up all night taking care of her. It made no sense. People did not do such things without expecting something in return. "What do you want from me?" she asked bluntly. Tobias looked surprised by the question. "Want from you, in return for all of this? The gold you gave Mrs. Henderson, the doctor, the supplies I can see over there." She gestured weakly toward the items on her dresser. "No one does such things from simple kindness. What is the price?" Understanding dawned in Tobias's eyes, followed by something that might have been sadness. "There is no price, Natalie. I am helping you because you needed help and I was able to provide it. That is all." "That is never all," Natalie said, bitterness sharpening her voice. "There is always a price, always something expected in return." Tobias was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "I am sorry that your experiences have taught you to think that way," he said finally. "But I promise you, I expect nothing from you except that you rest and allow yourself to heal. When you are well, you can go back to your life and I will go back to mine, and that will be the end of it." Natalie wanted to believe him, but years of hard lessons made trust difficult. Still, she was too weak to argue further, and the gentle concern in his eyes made something inside her want to hope that perhaps, just this once, someone was helping her without ulterior motives. "I need to use the necessary," she said, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. Tobias stood and helped her to her feet, keeping a steady arm around her waist when she swayed. "I will help you to the door. Can you manage from there?" The necessary was down the hall, a shared facility for the third-floor residents. Natalie made it there and back with Tobias's help, though the short journey left her trembling with exhaustion. He settled her back into bed and offered her some broth, which she managed to eat several spoonfuls of, before exhaustion claimed her again. Over the next 3 days, they fell into a routine. Tobias rarely left Natalie's side except to fetch fresh water, prepare meals, or update Dr. Morrison when he came for his daily visits. He slept in the chair, his large frame somehow finding a way to fold into the small space. He changed the cloths on her forehead, coaxed her to drink tea and broth, and helped her to the necessary when needed. He read to her from a book he found in her room, a collection of poetry that he stumbled over at first, unused to reading aloud, but gradually finding a rhythm to the words. Natalie, for her part, slowly began to trust him. How could she not, when he showed her nothing but kindness and respect? He never took advantage of her weakness, never made her feel ashamed of needing help. When he helped her to the necessary, or changed her sweat-dampened nightgown, he was brisk and efficient, treating her with the same matter-of-fact care he might give an injured animal. Yet there was tenderness, too, in the way he made sure she was comfortable, in the gentle touch of his rough hands when he checked her fever, in the concern that darkened his eyes when she had a particularly bad spell. On the fourth day, Natalie woke to find bright morning sunlight streaming through the window and Tobias asleep in the chair, his head tipped back at an angle that would surely give him a terrible crick in his neck. She studied him in the morning light, really looking at him for the first time since her mind was no longer clouded by fever. He was powerfully built, with muscles that came from years of hard physical labor rather than any deliberate cultivation. His face was weathered but handsome in a rough-hewn way, all strong lines and hard angles softened slightly by the dark hair that fell across his forehead as he slept. His hands, folded across his chest, were large and scarred, the hands of a man who worked with them every day. But they had been so gentle when they touched her, so careful despite their strength. As if sensing her regard, Tobias's eyes opened. For a moment he looked confused, as though he had forgotten where he was. Then his gaze sharpened and focused on her face. "You look better," he said, sitting up and immediately wincing at the protest from his stiff neck. "I feel better," Natalie said, and it was true. The fever had broken during the night, leaving her weak but clear-headed. "And you look terrible. You cannot keep sleeping in that chair. Your back will give out." "I have slept in worse places," Tobias said, rolling his shoulders to work out the stiffness. "How is your fever?" Natalie touched her own forehead experimentally. "I think it is gone, or at least much better." Tobias came to check for himself, his palm cool against her skin. His touch lingered for just a moment longer than strictly necessary, and Natalie found herself leaning into it slightly before he pulled away. "Much better," he confirmed, and there was relief in his voice. "Doctor Morrison said once the fever broke, you would recover quickly as long as you continued to rest and eat properly." "How long have I been ill?" "4 days since I found you. Probably a day or 2 before that, from what the doctor said." Tobias moved to the window and looked out at the mountains. "The weather has been holding, but we will get snow soon. I can feel it in the air." "You need to get back to your cabin before you are trapped here," Natalie said, sudden anxiety tightening her chest at the thought of him leaving, which was absurd. She had known him less than a week. He was a stranger who had shown her kindness, nothing more, yet the thought of him leaving filled her with an unreasonable sense of loss. "I have time yet," Tobias said, though he continued to look at the mountains with an expression that might have been longing. "The first snow will not be the one that closes the passes. That comes later." Over the next few days, as Natalie's strength slowly returned, they talked. Or rather, Natalie talked and Tobias listened, occasionally offering a comment or observation. She told him about growing up in Denver, about her father who had been a clerk in a bank before a series of bad investments ruined him, about her mother who had been a teacher before her marriage and had instilled in Natalie a love of learning and books. She told him about the loneliness of losing both parents, the terror of facing the world alone, the small humiliations and large fears that had brought her to Rico. Tobias, in turn, told her about his life in the mountains, though his stories came out slowly, as though he was unused to sharing such things. He had come west 10 years ago at 25, after spending his youth working on his family's farm in Ohio. His parents had died of cholera when he was 20, and his younger siblings had all married and started their own lives. Feeling unmoored and restless, he had sold his share of the farm to his brother and headed west, looking for something he could not quite name. He had tried mining first, then discovered he preferred the solitude of trapping and hunting. 5 years ago, he had built his cabin high in the mountains above Rico, in a valley so remote that he rarely saw another human being from the time the first snow fell until the spring thaw. He had everything he needed there: fresh water from a stream, game for meat, fish in the mountain lakes, timber for building and firewood, and most importantly, peace. "You never get lonely?" Natalie asked one afternoon as she sat propped up in bed, finally strong enough to feed herself the soup Tobias had brought from the kitchen. Tobias considered the question. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but loneliness is different from being lonely. In the mountains, I am alone, but I do not feel lonely because I chose that solitude. It is peaceful rather than isolating." "I think I understand," Natalie said softly. "I am surrounded by people here in town, but I have felt more lonely in the past 8 months than I ever did when I was by myself in Denver after my mother died." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. They were both solitary souls, though they had arrived at that state through different paths. By the end of the first week, Natalie was able to sit up for longer periods and even walk around her small room without becoming dizzy. Dr. Morrison pronounced her on the mend and reduced his visits to every other day. Mrs. Henderson, seeing that Natalie was recovering, began making pointed comments about when she might return to work. Tobias put her off each time with a combination of charm and implied threat that Natalie found impressive. She had never had anyone defend her interests so thoroughly, and she found herself relying on his presence more than was probably wise. But it was hard not to lean on someone who seemed so willing to be leaned upon. On the 8th day, Natalie insisted on getting dressed in proper clothes rather than her nightgown. Tobias helped her with the buttons on her dress, his fingers as deft as they had been when he undressed her that first day, though now the act felt somehow more intimate. She was aware of his hands on her back, of his breath stirring her hair, of the warmth of his body close behind her. "There," he said when the last button was fastened, but he did not step away immediately. Natalie could feel him standing there, could sense some internal struggle. Then his hands settled on her shoulders, gentle but firm, and he spoke in a voice roughened by emotion. "I am glad you are better." Natalie turned to face him, which brought them very close together in the small room. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Thanks to you, I would have kept working until I collapsed if you had not intervened. I might have died." "You did not," Tobias said firmly, as though saying it could make it retroactively certain. "You are here and you are getting stronger." "Why did you do all this?" Natalie asked, the question that had been circling in her mind for days finally finding voice. "And please do not say it was simple kindness. You gave up more than a week of your time, spent your gold, lost sleep, all for a stranger. There has to be a reason." Tobias's hands tightened slightly on her shoulders, and she saw him struggling for words. "Finally," he said, "when I saw you in the dining room that first day, trying so hard to keep going despite being obviously ill, something in me responded. I cannot explain it better than that. It was like seeing an animal caught in a trap, struggling to free itself. I could not walk away any more than I could walk past a trapped creature and leave it to suffer." "I am not a trapped animal," Natalie said, though there was no heat in the words. "Are you not?" Tobias challenged gently. "You said yourself you felt trapped here, trapped by circumstances, by Mrs. Henderson's demands by the lack of other options. That is different. Is it? They stood there, close together, the question hanging between them. Then Natalie did something brave. She rose up on her toes and pressed a gentle kiss to Tobias's cheek. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything." Tobias went very still, and Natalie worried she had overstepped. But then his arms came around her, pulling her into a careful embrace as though he was afraid she might break. She rested her head against his chest, hearing the strong, steady beat of his heart, feeling the warmth of his body seeping into her still recovering frame. They stood like that for a long moment, neither speaking, just holding each other. Then Tobias gently released her and stepped back. "You should rest," he said, his voice gruff. Dr. Morrison said not to overdo things, but Natalie had been resting for more than a week, and she was restless with the need to move, to do something other than lie in bed. "I want to go outside," she said, "just for a little while. I have been cooped up in this room for so long, and the weather is beautiful." Tobias looked like he wanted to argue, but he must have seen the determination in her eyes. "A short walk only," he conceded, "and you lean on me if you feel tired." They made their way downstairs slowly, Tobias's hand at her elbow, ready to catch her if she stumbled. Mrs. Henderson watched them from the kitchen doorway with an expression Natalie could not quite read. Outside, the October air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains and wood smoke from the town's chimneys. Rico spread out before them, a collection of wooden buildings arranged along streets that were more mud than road. Beyond the town, the San Juan Mountains rose in spectacular glory, their peaks already dusted with snow that gleamed white against the deep blue sky. Natalie breathed deeply, feeling the mountain air fill her lungs and clear away the last of the sickness that had plagued her. "It is beautiful here," she said. "I have been so focused on survival that I never really looked at it before. The mountains have a way of putting human concerns into perspective," Tobias said. He guided her to a bench outside the general store, and they sat down together, watching the town go about its business. Miners walked past, heading for the saloons. A woman with 2 small children hurried toward the general store. A group of men stood outside the assay office, examining what looked like chunks of ore and arguing about their value. Samuel Chen emerged from his store and greeted them warmly. "Miss Ashford, it is good to see you up and about. Tobias has been very worried about you." "He has taken excellent care of me," Natalie said, smiling up at Tobias. Samuel's eyes moved between them with obvious interest. "I am sure he has. Tobias is a good man, though he hides away in those mountains and makes us forget it." He turned to Tobias. "Will you be staying in town much longer?" "A few more days," Tobias said, and Natalie felt her heart sink at the reminder that his presence here was only temporary. "Until I am certain Miss Ashford is fully recovered. And then back to your cabin before the snow comes," Samuel said, nodding. "Well, it has been good to see more of you than usual. You should come to town more often." After Samuel went back inside, Natalie and Tobias sat in silence for a while. Finally, Natalie spoke, voicing the thought that had been growing in her mind. "What will I do when you leave?" "Go back to your life," Tobias said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Work at the inn, save your money, pursue your dream of a bookstore. You truly believe Mrs. Henderson will keep me on after this? She was already looking for an excuse to dismiss me. This gave her one. I paid her for a month of your absence. She cannot dismiss you for being ill when she has been compensated for it." "She will find another reason," Natalie said with certainty. "She never wanted me here in the first place. She only hired me because she could pay me less than anyone else would accept." Tobias knew she was probably right. He had seen Mrs. Henderson's type before, people who enjoyed having power over others, and who resented anyone they perceived as uppity or ungrateful. Then you will find another position. Dr. Morrison seems to think well of you. Perhaps he knows of something. But even as he said it, Tobias knew such positions were rare. Rico was a small town with limited opportunities, especially for a young woman alone. The thought of Natalie struggling, perhaps falling into circumstances that would compromise her independence or her safety, made his chest tight with an emotion he was not quite ready to name. They sat together until Natalie began to shiver from the cold. Then Tobias walked her back to the inn. But instead of going to her room, Natalie asked if they could sit in the parlor for a while. She was starved for company after days of isolation, and she was not ready to give up Tobias's presence yet. The parlor was a small room off the main dining area, with a fireplace and several worn but comfortable chairs. Tobias built up the fire while Natalie settled into a chair near the hearth. The warmth was wonderful, and she found herself relaxing in a way she had not allowed herself to do in months. "Tell me about your cabin," she said as Tobias took the chair across from her. "What is it like?" Tobias leaned back, his eyes taking on a distant look as he thought about his mountain home. "It is small, just one room really, but well built. I made it myself from pine logs. There is a fireplace that takes up most of one wall, a bed in one corner, a table and chairs, shelves for my supplies. The door faces east so I can see the sunrise. There is a stream about 50 yards away for water and a shelter for my horse and mules." "It sounds lonely," Natalie said. "It sounds peaceful," Tobias corrected gently. "In the winter, when the snow is deep, everything is quiet, so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat. I trap during the day, following the trails I have learned over the years. In the evenings, I sit by the fire and read or repair my equipment or just think. Sometimes weeks go by without me saying a word out loud. Do you not miss conversation? Miss having someone to talk to?" "I never thought I did," Tobias said, looking directly at her. "But these past days talking with you, I realize I have missed it more than I knew." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Natalie felt her heart beat faster. "I have enjoyed our conversations as well," she said softly. "More than I can say. You have been so kind to me, so patient. I feel like I can talk to you about anything." "You can," Tobias said. "Always." But always was a word that implied a future, and they both knew that once Tobias returned to his mountain cabin, they would likely never see each other again. The thought sat heavy in the room with them. The next day, Mrs. Henderson informed Natalie that she was expected to return to work the following morning. "You have had more than enough time to recover from your little illness," she said sharply. "And Mr. Brennan's gold does not give you license to laze about forever." Natalie wanted to argue, wanted to point out that she had been seriously ill, that she was still regaining her strength. But she knew it would do no good. Mrs. Henderson had made up her mind, and Natalie needed the job too much to risk open defiance. When she told Tobias, his jaw tightened with anger. "You are not ready to work full days yet. Dr. Morrison said you needed at least another week of light duties." "I do not have the luxury of following Dr. Morrison's advice," Natalie said tiredly. "I need this job, Tobias. Without it, I have nowhere to go and no way to support myself." Tobias paced the small parlor like a caged mountain lion. Natalie watched him, this powerful man who had appointed himself her protector, and felt a wave of affection so strong it almost frightened her. When had this stranger become so important to her? When had the thought of him leaving become unbearable? "Come with me," Tobias said suddenly, stopping his pacing to face her. Natalie blinked. "What? Come with me to my cabin? For the winter?" The words came out in a rush, as though he had been holding them back and they had suddenly broken free. "You do not want to stay here, and I do not want to leave you in a situation where you are not valued or cared for properly." "I cannot just leave with you," Natalie protested, though her heart leaped at the suggestion. "It would not be proper. People would assume things." "People will assume things anyway," Tobias said bluntly. "They already are after I spent more than a week in your room caring for you. Your reputation is likely already damaged beyond repair in this town." Natalie knew he was right, even though the knowledge stung. She had seen the looks, heard the whispers when she had been out yesterday. Mrs. Henderson herself had made a snide comment about Natalie's generous benefactor and what he might expect in return for his generosity. "Even if I wanted to come with you, what would I do in your cabin all winter? I cannot trap or hunt. I would be useless to you." "You would be company," Tobias said simply. "You could cook and keep the cabin while I work the trap lines. You could read by the fire and tell me about the books. You could be safe and warm instead of working yourself to exhaustion for a woman who does not appreciate you." It was tempting. More than tempting. The thought of spending the winter in a cozy cabin with Tobias, away from Mrs. Henderson's sharp tongue and the knowing looks of the townspeople, sounded like paradise. But there were practical considerations. And when spring comes, what then? Tobias had not thought that far ahead, but he forced himself to do so now. "Then we decide what comes next. Maybe you want to come back to Rico and try again. Maybe we go somewhere else, somewhere you could start your bookstore. Maybe we stay in the mountains." He paused, then added quietly, "Or maybe by then you will want nothing more to do with me and I will help you go wherever you want to go." "You would do that? Help me even if I decided to leave?" "Of course." Tobias looked surprised that she would even question it. "Natalie, I am offering you a choice, not another trap. If you come with me, it will be because you want to and you can leave whenever you want to." Natalie studied his face, seeing nothing but sincerity there. This man who had cared for her when she was sick, who had defended her against Mrs. Henderson's demands, who had spent his gold and his time without asking for anything in return, was now offering her an escape from her circumstances. More than that, he was offering her freedom to choose, something she had not had in a very long time. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Take all the time you need," Tobias replied. "But not too long. The weather will not wait for us to make up our minds." That night, Natalie lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind churning. The sensible thing would be to refuse Tobias's offer, to stay in Rico and try to make the best of her situation. But when had being sensible ever brought her happiness? She had been sensible when she came to Rico. She had been sensible when she took the job at the inn. She had been sensible her entire life. And where had it gotten her? She thought about Tobias's cabin in the mountains, about quiet evenings by the fire and days without the constant pressure to perform and please and prove her worth. She thought about Tobias himself, this strong, gentle man who had shown her more kindness in a week than she had experienced in the past year. She thought about how she felt when he was near, safe and valued and seen in a way she had not felt since her parents died. And she thought about the alternative, returning to work at the inn, enduring Mrs. Henderson's barbs and the townspeople's whispers, saving money penny by penny toward a future that always seemed to recede further into the distance, no matter how hard she reached for it. By morning, she had made her decision. She found Tobias in the dining room, eating breakfast and looking out the window at the mountains with an expression of longing. He looked up when she approached, and she saw both hope and resignation in his eyes, as though he expected her to refuse his offer. "I will come with you," she said without preamble, "if the offer still stands." The smile that broke across Tobias's face transformed it entirely, taking years off his weathered features and making her heart skip in her chest. "It stands," he said. "It will always stand." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Tobias had already acquired most of the supplies he would need for the winter, but now he bought extra food, extra blankets, things that would make the cabin more comfortable for 2 people instead of 1. Natalie gathered her few possessions, which fit easily into her single carpet bag. Mrs. Henderson was coldly furious when Natalie informed her that she was leaving. "You will never find another respectable position after this," she warned. "Running off to live in sin with a mountain man, it is disgraceful." "Then I suppose I will have to find an indecent position instead," Natalie replied, surprising herself with her boldness. "Good day, Mrs. Henderson." Dr. Morrison was more understanding. "I hope you know what you are doing, Miss Ashford," he said when she went to thank him for his care. "But I will say that Tobias Brennan is one of the most honorable men I have ever met. If he has offered you his protection, you can trust that he means it." Samuel Chen gave them provisions for the journey and refused to accept payment for half of it. "You take care of each other," he said, looking between them with warm approval. "And Tobias, you bring her back to visit in the spring. I want to hear how you both fared through the winter." On the morning they were set to leave, Natalie stood in the street outside the Mountain Rose Inn with her carpetbag in hand, and looked back at the building that had been her home for 8 months. She felt no regret at leaving it, only a sense of possibility opening up before her like the mountain valleys that stretched toward Tobias's cabin. Tobias had 3 mules loaded with supplies and his own horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Ranger. He helped Natalie onto the horse, then swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to hold the reins. The position put them in close contact, her back against his chest, his body warm and solid behind her. "Ready?" he asked, his breath stirring her hair. "Ready," Natalie confirmed. They rode out of Rico as the sun climbed higher in the sky, leaving behind the town and its narrow judgments. The trail climbed steadily into the mountains, following paths that were more suggestion than actual road. Natalie marveled at the beauty around them, the aspens turning gold in their autumn glory, the dark pines that marched up the mountainsides, the distant peaks crowned with snow. Tobias narrated their journey, pointing out landmarks and telling her the names of the peaks they passed. He showed her where a mother bear and her cubs had crossed the trail the previous spring, where he had found his richest gold pan, where an avalanche had nearly caught him 2 winters ago. Each story gave her another piece of this man who had become so important to her in such a short time. They made camp that night beside a stream, in a meadow surrounded by forest. Tobias set up a simple shelter using a canvas tarp and his bedrolls, then built a fire and prepared a meal of beans and bacon. Natalie tried to help, but he waved her away. "You are still recovering," he said. "There will be plenty of time for you to work once we reach the cabin. Tonight, just rest." After they had eaten, they sat by the fire and watched the stars emerge in the vast darkness above the mountains. Natalie had never seen so many stars. In Denver, the city lights had dimmed them, and in Rico she had been too busy and exhausted to look up. But here, far from any artificial light, the Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light. "It is beautiful," she breathed. "Yes," Tobias agreed, but when she glanced at him, he was looking at her rather than the sky. Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, the companionable ease of the past days deepening into something more intense. Tobias reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Natalie," he said, her name rough in his throat. "I need you to know that when I invited you to my cabin, I did not expect anything from you beyond your company. You will have your own bed. I will not impose on you or pressure you in any way." "I know," Natalie said softly. "You have been nothing but honorable with me, Tobias. I trust you." "I am glad," he said, "because I find myself caring for you more than I probably should. And I do not want you to feel that you owe me anything because of it." Natalie felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. "I care for you too," she admitted. "More than I expected to. More than is probably wise given how short a time we have known each other." "The heart does not keep track of time," Tobias said. "It just knows what it knows." He leaned closer, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but Natalie did not want to pull away. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted to know what it felt like to be kissed by this strong, gentle man who had crashed into her life like a force of nature and turned everything upside down. Their lips met softly at first, a gentle exploration. Then Tobias's hand came up to cup the back of her head, and the kiss deepened into something that made Natalie's heart race and her breath catch. She clutched at his shoulders, feeling the solid muscle beneath the buckskin, and kissed him back with all the emotion she had been holding inside. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Tobias rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for days," he admitted. "Why did you wait?" Natalie asked. "Because you were sick and then recovering, and I did not want you to feel obligated. I wanted you to want it too." "I do want it," Natalie said firmly. "I want you, Tobias. I do not fully understand it myself, but I cannot deny it either." They kissed again and then again, learning the taste and feel of each other. But when Tobias's hands began to wander, he forced himself to stop and pull back. "We should sleep," he said, though his voice was strained. "We have a long ride ahead of us tomorrow." He set up the bedrolls carefully, side by side but with enough space between them to be proper. They lay down in their respective beds, the fire crackling between them and the stars wheeling overhead. But despite the space between them, Natalie fell asleep thinking about Tobias, and Tobias fell asleep thinking about her, and both of them smiled in their dreams. The next day's ride took them even higher into the mountains, following trails that grew increasingly narrow and steep. Natalie was grateful for Ranger's sure-footedness and for Tobias's strong arms around her, keeping her steady as the horse navigated rocky switchbacks and stream crossings. They reached the cabin in the late afternoon, when the sun was beginning to sink behind the western peaks. It sat in a small valley, just as Tobias had described, with a stream running nearby and forest all around. The cabin was solidly built, with a stone chimney rising from one end and a small porch across the front. Nearby stood a lean-to shelter for the animals and a storage shed for supplies. Tobias helped Natalie down from the horse, and she stood looking at the cabin that would be her home for the next several months. It was not much, this simple structure in the wilderness, but something about it called to her. Maybe it was the peace of the setting, or the obvious care Tobias had taken in building it, or simply the fact that she had chosen to be here. "Welcome home," Tobias said softly, and the words made something settle in Natalie's chest. Inside, the cabin was exactly as he had described. One room with a large fireplace, a bed in one corner, a table and chairs, shelves lining the walls. But Tobias had been busy during the days before they left Rico. A second bed now stood in the opposite corner from his own, made up with new blankets and a pillow. A rocking chair sat near the fireplace, and a rag rug brightened the floor. "You did all this for me?" Natalie asked, looking around in wonder. "I wanted you to be comfortable," Tobias said, suddenly shy. "I know it is not much compared to what you are used to." "It is perfect," Natalie said honestly. The room was warm and cozy, filled with the scent of pine and wood smoke. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, and the shelves held books, supplies, and various tools and equipment. It was clearly a home, not just a shelter, and that made all the difference. Over the next few days, they established a rhythm to their days. Tobias rose early to tend to the animals and check his trap lines. Natalie woke when the sun came through the cabin's single window and started breakfast. By the time Tobias returned, there would be hot food waiting and the cabin warm from the fire. Natalie discovered that she enjoyed the domestic tasks she had resented at the inn. Here, she was not cooking and cleaning for ungrateful strangers, but creating a home for herself and Tobias. She learned to make bread in the cast iron pot Tobias owned, to stretch their supplies with creative combinations, to keep the cabin clean and orderly. In the afternoons, while Tobias worked on various projects around the cabin, preparing for the deep winter to come, Natalie explored the valley. She walked along the stream, discovering the places where it widened into pools so clear she could see the trout swimming in them. She found a grove of aspens that rattled their golden leaves in the slightest breeze, making a sound like gentle rain. She sat on a boulder overlooking the valley and watched eagles soar overhead, riding the mountain thermals. The evening was their time together. They would eat dinner by the fire, then sit and talk or read. Tobias was working his way through a collection of Shakespeare plays that he admitted he did not always understand. So Natalie would explain the difficult passages, and they would discuss the stories. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, Tobias carving or mending equipment while Natalie sewed or read. And sometimes, as the days passed and they grew more comfortable with each other, they would sit closer together on the hearth. Tobias would put his arm around her shoulders, and she would lean against his solid warmth. They would kiss, soft and sweet, exploring this new dimension of their relationship, but never pushing it further than Natalie was ready for. The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that made the valley look like it had been sprinkled with sugar. Natalie stood on the porch and laughed with delight, holding out her hands to catch the flakes. Tobias came to stand beside her, watching her joy with a soft expression. "You are not worried about being snowed in?" he asked. "No," Natalie said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I feel safer here than I have felt anywhere since my parents died." "Is that strange?" "Not strange," Tobias said. He pulled her against his side and they stood together watching the snow fall. "This place has that effect. It is separate from the rest of the world, a sanctuary." As November turned to December, the snows grew heavier and more frequent. The valley transformed into a winter wonderland, the stream freezing at its edges, the trees heavy with snow. Tobias's trap lines brought in rabbit and ermine, marten and fox. He showed Natalie how to scrape and stretch the pelts, though he did not require her to help with that task when he saw it made her squeamish. They celebrated Christmas simply, with a pine tree that Tobias cut and brought inside, and gifts they made for each other. Natalie had sewn Tobias a new shirt from fabric he had in his supplies, painstakingly making each stitch as small and even as she could. Tobias had carved her a beautiful set of bookends in the shape of mountains. "So your books will always have a home, even here in the wilderness," he said as he gave them to her. Natalie threw her arms around his neck and kissed him, not caring that it was forward or improper. She was tired of propriety. She wanted to live honestly, to feel honestly, to love honestly. And she did love him. She had known it for weeks but had been afraid to say it, afraid he might not feel the same way. But now, with his arms around her and the firelight flickering over them and the snow falling softly outside, she could not hold it in any longer. "I love you," she said when the kiss ended. "I know it is fast and perhaps I should not say it, but I cannot pretend otherwise. I love you, Tobias Brennan." The smile that broke over his face was like sunrise over the mountains. "I love you too, Natalie Ashford. I have loved you since I saw you trying to work through that fever, so stubborn and brave. I love your intelligence and your strength and the way you laugh when you see something that delights you. I love everything about you." They kissed again, and this time when Tobias's hands began to wander, Natalie did not stop him. She had made her choice long ago when she left Rico with him, and she made it again now with her whole heart. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted to join her life with his in every way possible. Tobias picked her up and carried her to his bed, laying her down gently on the blankets. "Are you sure?" he asked, even as his body trembled with want. "We do not have to rush this." "I am sure," Natalie said, reaching up to pull him down to her. "I have never been more sure of anything." They made love slowly and tenderly, Tobias patient with her inexperience, Natalie eager to learn and give and receive. The fire crackled in the hearth and the wind whispered outside, and in that small cabin high in the mountains, they became fully and completely each other's. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Natalie's head on Tobias's chest and his arms around her. "I never want to leave here," she whispered. "I never want this winter to end." "Winters always end," Tobias said, stroking her hair. "But we do not have to go back to Rico if you do not want to. We could stay here or go somewhere else. As long as we are together, it does not matter where we are." "Do you mean that?" Natalie asked, lifting her head to look at him. "You would leave your cabin for me?" "I would leave anything for you," Tobias said seriously. "This cabin is just a building, Natalie. You are my home now." Tears filled her eyes, happy tears this time. She kissed him again, trying to pour all her love and gratitude and joy into the gesture. "Then we will stay," she said. "Here together. We will build our life here in the mountains." "What about your dream of a bookstore?" Tobias asked. Natalie considered this. "Perhaps I can still have that in a different way. In the spring, when you go to trade your furs, we could get books. We could build up a library here. And maybe, when other trappers or travelers come through, they could borrow books from us. It would be a different kind of bookstore, but it would be mine." "Ours," Tobias corrected gently. "Everything I have is yours now." As winter deepened and the snows piled higher, they settled into their new life together as partners in every sense of the word. They worked side by side, Natalie taking on more of the outdoor tasks as she grew stronger and more skilled. She learned to use snowshoes to navigate the deep drifts, to read the weather signs, to move quietly through the forest without disturbing the wildlife. Tobias, in turn, learned to share his solitary life, to talk more, to think in terms of we instead of I. He found he enjoyed teaching Natalie the skills he had accumulated over years of mountain living, enjoyed seeing the world through her fresh eyes. Things he had taken for granted became new and wonderful when she pointed them out. The way the ice formed intricate patterns on the cabin windows, the tracks of various animals in the snow, the brilliant stars on clear, cold nights. They talked about their future, making plans for the years ahead. In the spring, they would go to Rico and be properly married, though in their hearts they already considered themselves wed. They would use Tobias's furs and gold to buy more land, to build a larger cabin, to start the life they wanted together. "We could have children," Tobias said one night as they lay together in bed. "If you want them." Natalie had not allowed herself to think about children before, when her future had seemed so uncertain. But now, with Tobias beside her in a home she loved, the thought of a baby filled her with joy. "I would like that," she said. "Very much." February brought the deepest snows and the coldest temperatures. For days at a time they were confined to the cabin, but they did not mind. They had each other and books to read and projects to work on. Tobias taught Natalie to carve wood, and she discovered she had a talent for it. She made simple things at first, spoons and cups, but gradually attempted more complex projects. In March, the first hints of spring began to appear. The days grew longer and slightly warmer. The snow began to melt from the south-facing slopes. Birds returned from their winter grounds, filling the mornings with song. Natalie and Tobias emerged from their winter cocoon, blinking in the brighter light and taking stock of their valley. "We made it through," Natalie said wonderingly. "A whole winter in the mountains." "You did more than survive it," Tobias said, pride clear in his voice. "You thrived. You are a mountain woman now." Natalie liked the sound of that. She had come to the mountains as a desperate young woman fleeing an untenable situation. She had stayed because a kind stranger had shown her compassion when she needed it most. And she had become something new here, someone stronger and more capable than she had ever been before. As the snow continued to melt and the passes began to clear, they prepared for their trip to Rico. They would go to buy supplies, to get married, to begin their new life officially. Natalie felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of seeing Mrs. Henderson and the other townspeople again, but Tobias's steady presence gave her courage. "They can think what they like," he reminded her. "We know the truth of what we have here. That is all that matters." The journey to Rico took 2 days, the trails still muddy and treacherous from the snowmelt. But when they rode into town, Natalie sitting in front of Tobias on Ranger with her head held high, she felt none of the shame or uncertainty that had plagued her months ago. She was loved and valued, and that changed everything. Samuel Chen was the first to greet them, coming out of his store with a wide smile. "I knew you would make it through the winter," he said warmly. "Both of you look healthy and happy." "We are," Tobias confirmed, his arm tightening around Natalie's waist. "Very happy. We want to get married." "Then you should see Reverend Thompson," Samuel said. "He will be delighted to perform the ceremony." Dr. Morrison was equally pleased to see them, and he gave Natalie a clean bill of health when Tobias insisted she be examined. "Mountain living agrees with you, Miss Ashford," the doctor said with approval. "You look stronger than when you left." "I feel stronger," Natalie said. "In every way." They were married 3 days later in the small church at the edge of town. Natalie wore a new dress that Samuel's wife had helped her make, simple but pretty in pale blue. Tobias wore his buckskins, cleaned and mended, his long hair trimmed slightly but still falling past his collar. Samuel and his wife stood as witnesses, along with Dr. Morrison and a few other townspeople who had shown them kindness. Mrs. Henderson did not attend, but Natalie saw her watching from the window of the inn as they walked from the church to Samuel's store for a small celebration. The older woman's face was sour with disapproval, but Natalie found she did not care. Mrs. Henderson's opinions no longer had any power over her. They stayed in Rico for a week, conducting business and socializing with the few people who had become friends. But both of them were eager to return to their mountain home, to the peace and privacy of their valley. Town life felt too crowded, too noisy, too full of judgment and artifice after months of simple honesty in the mountains. On their last night in Rico, they lay together in the small room Tobias had rented at a different inn, one run by a kind widow who did not ask intrusive questions. Natalie turned to her husband, still marveling at the word, and kissed him. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" Tobias asked, pulling her closer. "For seeing me that day at the Mountain Rose Inn, for caring when you did not have to, for giving me a choice when I had none, for loving me." "I did not do anything special," Tobias protested. "I just did what any decent person would do." "No," Natalie said firmly. "Most people would have walked past me. Most people would not have cared about a stranger's welfare, but you stopped. You helped. You changed my entire life." Tobias kissed her forehead. "You changed my life too." "I did not know how lonely I was until I was not lonely anymore. You brought light and warmth to my mountain, Natalie. You made my cabin a home. They returned to the cabin in early April to find that spring had truly arrived in their valley. Wildflowers dotted the meadows, and new green growth covered the trees. The stream ran high and fast with snowmelt, and the air smelled of pine and earth and new beginnings. They spent the spring and summer building their life together. Tobias panned for gold in the stream, while Natalie tended a small garden she had planted near the cabin. They added a room onto the cabin, creating more space for the family they hoped to have. They acquired more books from traders and travelers, slowly building the mountain library Natalie had dreamed of. In the fall, Natalie discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and a touch of nervousness. They were far from town, far from a doctor, but they had each other and the skills they had learned over the past year. Samuel's wife, who had borne 6 children herself, gave them advice and supplies when they made their autumn trip to Rico. The winter was harder with Natalie pregnant, but Tobias was endlessly patient and caring. He took over more of the physical work, insisting she rest and stay warm. He rubbed her swollen feet and brought her tea when she felt nauseated in the mornings. He read to her for hours, anything she wanted, his deep voice soothing and steady. Their son was born in late March, during a late-season snowstorm. Natalie labored for hours while Tobias held her hand and encouraged her, and when the baby finally arrived, healthy and squalling, they both wept with joy and relief. They named him Thomas, after Tobias's father, and he had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. Over the years that followed, their family grew. A daughter came next, then another son, then twin girls. The cabin expanded to accommodate them all, growing from a simple one-room structure to a proper house with multiple bedrooms, and a large central room where they gathered for meals and evenings by the fire. Natalie's mountain library became known throughout the region, and trappers and travelers would often stop to borrow books or just to visit. She would serve them tea and food, and they would share news from the wider world. Some stayed for days, enjoying the hospitality and the rare company of children in the wilderness. Tobias continued to trap and pan for gold, teaching his sons the skills they would need to survive in the mountains. But he also taught them to read and write, to think critically, to treat others with respect and kindness. He taught his daughters the same things, plus how to shoot and trap and navigate the wilderness, refusing to limit them based on their gender. And through it all, through the hard times and the good times, through illness and health, through the long winters and the brief summers, Tobias and Natalie loved each other. They had found something rare that day in the dining room of the Mountain Rose Inn, when a mountain man had seen a young woman in need and chosen to help. They had built on that foundation of kindness and compassion, creating a life filled with love and purpose and joy. Years later, when their children were grown and starting families of their own, Natalie and Tobias would sit together on the porch of their mountain home and watch the sun set behind the peaks. They would hold hands, their fingers intertwined, and remember the journey that had brought them here. "Do you ever regret it?" Tobias asked one evening, though he knew the answer. "Leaving Rico with me, giving up your dreams of a bookstore in town?" "Never," Natalie said firmly. She gestured to the house behind them, where shelves of books lined every wall, and to the valley spread before them, where their children's cabins dotted the landscape. "I got my bookstore, just in a different form, and I got so much more. I got you. I got our family. I got a life beyond anything I could have imagined when I was that sick, desperate girl working herself to death at an inn." "I am glad," Tobias said, pulling her closer, "because that day I saw you in the dining room was the luckiest day of my life. I thought I was saving you, but really, you saved me. We saved each other," Natalie corrected, and kissed him as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear overhead. They had built something beautiful together, something that would endure in the children they raised, and the love they shared, and the home they created high in the Colorado mountains. It had started with a simple act of kindness, with a stranger who chose to help rather than look away. But it had grown into something extraordinary, a love story written in the language of mountain peaks and pine forests, of quiet moments by the fire and shared laughter echoing through the valleys. And as they sat together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the wilderness they loved and the family they had created, Tobias and Natalie knew they had found exactly what they had been searching for all along, even when they did not know they were searching. They had found home. They had found love. They had found each other. The end.